So my name is Daniel Castro. I'm Vice President of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation and Director of our Center for Data Innovation. For those of you that don't know the Center, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank working on the intersection of data technology and public policy. I'd like to welcome you to this morning's event, What Can Be Done to Protect Endangered Government Data. Before we begin, a few logistics. First, the event's being recorded. Hopefully at some point it will also be webcast. If you do get to follow along in the webcast, I'll announce this again, but we are using the hashtag data innovation. If you're tweeting in the room, we encourage you to use that. You can also ask questions of the panelists using that hashtag. We're also going to have time at the end for some Q&A. But just to kind of set the stage here, one of the interesting things I've seen following the conversation on the Parkland shootings earlier this month is that there have been a number of articles on gun violence that have made the point that there are few evidence-based policies to reduce gun violence. And the problem isn't that no interventions work, it's that we don't know which ones work because we don't have good data. And if you go back and you look at the legislative history here, it was in 1996 where Congress prohibited the CDC from studying gun control, and they defunded these efforts, and they really made a big push that led to not necessarily a wholesale prohibition on this type of research, but basically a significant reduction in it, so it's almost non-existent. Likewise, Congress has prevented ATF from collecting information from owners or dealers on assault rifles. So the impact is that we have very poor government data about gun ownership and gun violence, which means no matter your stance on this issue, we don't have evidence-based policy to address many of the issues today. And I think what's interesting here is evidence-based policy making is something that's supposed to be a bipartisan goal. That shared goal is to make government more fair, more objective, and more rational. As Senator Pat Moynihan famously said, everyone's entitled to their own opinions, but they're not entitled to their own facts. And the message was that it's fine to debate different ideas, but we should have a common basis of understanding of reality. And government data, I think, has long served this role as an authoritative source of information about the state of our society and our economy. Unfortunately, I think my concern is that people realize sometimes they can't always win in the battle of ideas because they don't have data on their side. And so instead of having an honest fight over policy, they're waging a war on data. And I think the only way to really stop this is if we create a culture and norm around government data about what is acceptable, what's standard and expected in this area. So we need to figure out how we maintain high standards across the board, no matter the issue, to ensure government data is accurate, timely, available, and open. And so there's three main themes I want to get into this morning and have us cover. First, I want to talk about why government data matters. Second, what risks are there to government data, risks that we've seen play out, in particular, I think, over the last 18 months. And how do we address the problem of endangered data? What should we be looking at as we move forward? So we have a fantastic panel here today. I'm really pleased that they're all able to make time to be with us this morning. Starting on my left, we have Gavin Baker, who's Assistant Director of Government Relations at the American Library Association. To his left, John Thompson, Executive Director of the Council of Professional Associations on Federal Statistics. Continuing down the line, Denise Ross, who's a Public Interest Technology Fellow at New America. Paul Farber, Managing Director of the PIN Program in Environmental Humanities, and Patricia Kim, who's co-founder of Data Refuge. So thanks to all of you for being here today. Maybe, Gavin, I'll start with you. Just on this kind of broader question of why government data matters. I mean, your organization, you personally, have been one of the, I think, very active champions of open government data here in Washington. Especially over the past few years as you've been working on the Open Government Data Act. Just talk to us a little bit. Why do you support open government data? Why is this a priority for you and your organizations?
Well, thank you, Daniel, and thanks to the Center for Data Innovation putting together this very interesting event on a very important topic. When it comes to open government data and libraries exist to help people find and access information and to answer questions. And open government data helps us do that. And I will give you an example to demonstrate why. Imagine that you own a pizzeria and people come into your pizzeria and they say, I came all the way from across town to get here because you have great pizza, and I really wish that you delivered to me because I'd order from you all the time if you would deliver. So you get to thinking, maybe we should open a second location. You know, we can make some more money, create a couple jobs, generate some tax revenue, and most importantly, make people happy with pizza. But second location, it's a big risk. It's a big investment. It's going to be really critical to find the right place for this pizzeria to go. If we open a second location and we start delivering to people and it takes a long time for them to get their pizza, they're not going to be happy when it gets there. So it's really critical that we find the right spot so that we can get the pizza to people quickly for our target market. So you are a pizza specialist. You are not a demographic data specialist. So you Google it, try a couple searches, you look at a couple of results. You're not quite finding what will work for you to try to figure out, you know, where in town is the best place to open your second location of your pizzeria. So you say, you know what, the shop's closed on Monday. I'm going to go into the library. The business librarian there probably knows exactly what I'm looking for. And as soon as I tell them, they'll be able to help me. And you're right, before you can even finish asking your question, they're already typing away, turn their monitor over to you, and they've gone to the Census Bureau website. They've pulled up the interactive population map, and they're telling you put in your zip code here, click on this layer. You can zoom in. Here's how you can select, look at each census tract, see how many people in each age bracket are in each census tract. And, you know, you've told me that you think that your customers are most likely going to be young people, and so you might want to be looking at the 25 to 34 age bracket, and here's how you can see how many of those people are in each census tract. This open data helps us answer questions that people walk into libraries every day asking questions like that, whether it's demographic data, economic data, environmental data, regulatory data, data about government performance, helps us answer questions. And whether they are using it directly from the government or whether open data has enabled a third party to incorporate that data into another service, some kind of a tech company, either way, it helps us answer more questions, which is our mission, and that's why open data is important to libraries.
Thanks. And Denise, I mean, you've worked on this issue. You've looked at this issue quite a lot, and I think not always just in terms of how it impacts businesses, but also, I mean, just kind of very directly on individuals, in particular, some vulnerable populations. Can you talk about some of your work in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. So I come out of the city of New Orleans. I was working for a local data intermediary when Katrina happened, and we went from begging people to use data to make better decisions to people begging us for data after the storm because their old ways of making decisions didn't work anymore. But after the storm, which happened in between the 2000 and 2010 decennial censuses, there were no data to light the path for recovery. And so what happened instead is that residents in neighborhoods that had resources and time started collecting their own data on population, literally walking the streets. And you had other data collection efforts that sprung up. And then, so on top of the incredible destruction that the city had, we now then had a growing data disparity where some neighborhoods had better information to make decisions about their recovery path forward, and other neighborhoods were still flying blind. And that's really the power of federal data, is that it is fair to everybody. It covers everyone in the country, every inch of land in the country. And I have just a few simple examples of how different data sets are used by regular people to improve their lives. For example, ranchers, when they experience a drought, they rely on NOAA's data that feeds into the drought monitor, and then they can use their location in the drought monitor to demonstrate to the USDA and the IRS that they need tax or relief or other assistance to help get through this drought. So ranchers depend on this to get through hard times. Cities and nonprofits use American Community Survey data from the Census Bureau to identify where the most vulnerable populations are so they can set up cooling stations when there's an extreme heat wave so people don't die in their homes. And lastly, this is one of my favorite examples, community colleges. For example, a community college in the state of Kansas used BLS workforce data to identify emerging professions that they needed to train residents for. So, for example, wind farm technician, they saw was a rising profession that they needed to set up a program for, and that reduced the risk of that community college in setting up that new program.
Thanks. Patricia, I want to bring you in this conversation because I think you also have a different perspective, and what's I think so interesting about open data is you see all these different perspectives of how the data is being used. But your work's looked at open data's impact on our cultural and national heritage. Can you talk about some of your work? Because I think that's something that is often underappreciated in the open data conversations.
Absolutely. And just to disclaim before I answer that great question, I think Paul and I, if I can speak for Paul, represent a very different kind of background. For instance, I'm an art historian and an archaeologist by trade. I'm a PhD candidate. And so you might ask, why does someone like me, what stake do I have in open data? Well, what I've found with my research in particular is that open data actually has a lot. So the work that we do has a lot of sort of implications, and we have a huge stake in these conversations, particularly in terms of research as well as in terms of actually how policy is formed. But before I sort of talk about this, I think it's important to distinguish and define what we mean by cultural, national, and natural heritage. It's easy to sort of separate these categories of cultural and natural, but oftentimes these distinctions are blurred. And so how we defined heritage is that it is a public good. For instance, it might be a sort of cuisine or a mountain or a river or the city of Washington, D.C., a beautiful statue of some important American leader, right? So it really covers a range of things. And the reason why this is important is because it helps shape communal identity, right? What American or different kinds of identities look like. But on the other hand, it has a huge impact on economies at various different scales. And a number of colleagues and I are starting to develop a project that really looks into how genocide, as well as cultural violence, how that is often hand in hand or correlates with the destruction of that group's cultural violence. So as you can see, it has a lot of different kinds of impact in terms of how policy is made. And very simply, what we do is we actually use a lot of what we would call environmental data, right? So for instance, archaeologists have used Landsat images from NASA. That's just one of the most important kinds of data sets that we use. So very simply, that's how we use open data, but we also are creating open data. So for instance, a lot of us are very committed to open science, right? That's not only worried about data stewardship as well as literacy, but also data access, right? Open access to different kinds of publics. We often talk about a public, but what does a public actually mean? And so I think I gave sort of a varied answer that I'm willing to elaborate on a bit later, but those are just only a few examples for why sort of open data, in my opinion, has a lot of kind of potential impact for a number of different fields of research as well as policy.
Yeah, thanks. I guess, Paul, let me just bring you on that point too, since your work's in kind of a related field there. Why do you think open data is important?
When we think about the functionality of democracy, we're thinking about the ways that representation lives, the way that not just power flows through a society, through a city, through a region, but also the way information is a vital source in understanding the way that we make decisions, the way that we shape our present, and the way we shape our legacies. I think when it comes to the question of open data, and to echo some of the other panelists, the idea of standardization, the idea of broad reaching, the idea of accessible, it correlates with a lot of conversations that we have about the health of our democracy. Do people have access to the tools, to the information, and to the relationships that fuel functional societies? How do we think about conversations about equity, about justice, as part of a conversation about power? And of course, access to data is access to power. It's the ability to understand what you've inherited and what you are shaping. So I think, from our standpoint, when I say we, Patricia and I, but also our colleagues at Penn and other partners, the Union of Concerned Scientists, we're thinking about data not just as information that is separate from us that we're looking to reach, but instead as kind of the fabric of relationships in which we can access, create, shape, and share information that's vital to us.
Thank you, Paul. And John, I kind of saved you for last year because you've had this interesting perspective of being both on the inside of government, producing the data, and now being on the outside. So I want you to kind of reflect on a similar question, particularly the Census Bureau, which I think has some of the nation's most valuable data. Yet many people, I think, still don't truly understand its value. There's always debates about whether this is a worthwhile activity to be engaged in, whether it's worth the cost. Why is census data in particular? Why don't we start there? Why is census data important?
So I do need to say that in my new organization, we have stakeholders that use data from the federal statistical system for all aspects, and that would be the data that comes out in the agricultural area that describes food safety, data that comes out and describes the health and well-being of children, data that comes out from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that describes our workforce and puts out important indicators like CPI. But let me focus for a little bit on census. So the Census Bureau produces both economic and demographic data. They produce 13 key principal economic indicators that come out on a monthly or quarterly basis that describe our economy. They produce the American Community Survey, which has already been referenced here, and it's used in just a variety of things. I mean, I sometimes work with some people at the Shopping Centers Federation, and that's what gives investors the confidence, particularly in rural areas, to determine where they would invest to put a shopping center in, because they need data to make the capital investment, and therefore help rural communities. So the data is incredibly important. Underlying all of the demographic data that we collect is the decennial census, and I can't stress the importance of the decennial census to providing really, really accurate open data. So to start with, I think everyone knows the census is used to reapportion to Congress. The census is used to support fair and accurate redistricting. The census data are used to allocate over $600 billion on an annual basis of federal funds to a variety of programs to support needs. And on top of that, the data in the census are very complete, and they are used to ensure the accuracy in virtually every single data collection activity that's done on a household basis. So the American Community Survey would not be as accurate as it is without having a base that was a good decennial census that is then carried forward over the years. So that's why there's so much concern about the accuracy of, say, the 2020 census. Because if there is an inaccuracy in the 2020 census, that will be with us for 10 years. And that inaccuracy or lack of representation will carry over into surveys like the American Community Survey, the Current Population Survey, the Health Interview Survey, the surveys that private sector companies do. So that lack of representation will be with us for 10 years. And that's why there's so much concern about. That's one of the reasons there's so much concern about the accuracy of the census.
Thank you. I mean, certainly from a lot of the work that we're doing right now around artificial intelligence, this demographic data is just vital. One of the biggest questions that comes up with AI as it relates to discrimination and bias is how do you stop that? And, one of the things that we've talked a lot about is the need to be able to do disparate impact analysis, right? But, fundamentally, the only way you can do that is if you have good data on which you can analyze the results. So when we think about, just technological progress and AI being key to U.S. competitiveness, this. I mean, this gets to a key area because there's going to be significant resistance to using these technologies if we don't have the data in place to be able to deploy them. Jolly, I did want to ask you to talk a little bit about some of the other federal statistical agencies as well. As you noted, this is obviously what you're focusing on in your current role, and it's also, I think, something that people don't. The average citizen doesn't realize there's so much federal statistics out there. There's so many different agencies working on a number of different problems. Some would say maybe there's too many agencies. We could do a little combining there. But besides the organizational structure, can you talk about just the variety of data that we have out there and the different uses you're seeing?
Sure. So the data infrastructure that I used to participate in and that I represent now is essentially the federal statistical system. And the federal statistical system consists of 13 primary statistical agencies. They are coordinated by the chief statistician of the United States, who at this point happens to be Nancy Potok, and is providing direction for these agencies. But, and you can find these agencies on the COPAF's website, www.copafs.org. It's pretty easy to find. But if you start with, say, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that's all your workforce statistics, it's your pricing, it's your productivity. It comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It goes to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, along with census data and some other data, where they calculate GDP, which is a key economic indicator that gets put out. The National Center for Health Statistics provides the very standards on which we base the health of the country. They provide critical information about, well, right now they're providing critical information about the opioid epidemic. If you go to the Department of Transportation, Bureau of Transportation Statistics is putting out important data about our roads and our infrastructure there. And you can go to the agricultural area, the Economic Research Service and the National Agricultural Statistical Service put out just key information on our agriculture, our crop yields, our farm productivity, our food security, our food safety. Those are all really, really important statistics that underlie our country. So that's a snapshot of what some of these agencies do. And you can see that they're all really, really important data.
Great. So I want to move into kind of the fundamental question that we wanted to talk about today, which is what are the risks to government data? So let me just, I think I'll just open it up to the panel. Maybe Denise, I'll throw it to you first, but I want everyone to feel free to jump in on this because at the outset of the new administration, there were a lot of people that were concerned about that the era of open data might be over. And it wasn't, there were a lot of reasons for this, right? I mean, there's obviously concerns about certain types of data and the different politics surrounding different types of data. There was also just a concern about the fact that it was, President Obama's Open Data Initiative, an executive order that created open data in the federal government. And without legislation, codifying that, we wouldn't actually have any federal policy still requiring that same level of openness. So I just want to kind of maybe we can start there. In terms of what risk did we have at that time, and what risk have actually come true?
Yeah, well, I think the good news is it's not as bad as we feared, and part of that I attribute to the work of the Data Refuge group, which really raised the nation's awareness about these valuable assets, data assets that could be at risk. And I think the mere act of holding these data refuge events around the country itself probably stemmed some of the data loss we might have seen. And I do want to make a distinction between the federal statistical system that John was talking about that's harder to unravel than the open data administrative data sets that agencies have been releasing since 2009, and the type of data that comes as open data that isn't part of the federal statistical system can be really valuable. For example, FEMA releases their individual assistance data. So after Harvey and Irma and Maria, you could see how many people were receiving individual assistance from FEMA. So it gives you a sense for the scope of the number of people. who were impacted. And that's just become the new normal in FEMA, releasing these types of data sets. There's intrinsic value to federal agencies for releasing this data. It reduces their public records request burden. It helps them get ahead of news requests, gives everyone the access to the same information so that news agencies can report based on better information. So there's a lot of value, and I think the toothpaste is out of the tube, with open data, but there are still risks, and there's so many ways to undermine open data. For example, you can start to shave off attributes. You can release fewer data tables, as the FBI recently did with their uniform crime reports. They decreased the number of data tables that they publish in their annual report by 2/3. Now, the data are still available if you ask them for the raw data, but there you're increasing the barrier to access. So technically it's still available, but it's much harder for regular people to access. There's also ways you can sort of slow walk the release of data, saying that you need more approval or more time to check accuracy. You can give short shrift to documentation. You can change the data schema so it's not comparable across years. You can start to aggregate some of the data so it's not as useful. The FBI has done that also with their UCR data. And then, of course, you can just set up bureaucratic barriers to people accessing the data. So if the will's not there, the data is not going to flow as freely. And so I think that's why it's so important as citizens, for us not to take the data for granted. It doesn't sprout forth from Zeus's head or from Google. It comes from real agencies that are doing real work, and better attribution of when people use data, I think, will help with that. And I wanted to point out one more thing. I was surprised to read 538 did a report on that FBI data, and the FBI staff justified pulling down the data tables because their web statistics showed that not many people had been downloading them. For what it's worth, it's not a great way to assess data value, but that appears to be where we are.
I actually want to dovetail on what Denise was saying about the presentation and access of data. So for instance, excuse me. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Try bringing it just a little closer to you.
Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to dovetail on what Denise mentioned about presentation and access to open data. As I assume that you are all familiar with the EPA and the current head of the EPA, and how, for instance, the word climate change or climate is being replaced by something like clean power. I don't even know. Something that really boils it down to something that is not as urgent sounding. And so presentation and access are definitely problems, but I also, what I'm concerned about in terms of, or what I've learned through the Data Refuge project is problems around the production of data that is going to be open to the public. So for instance, what kinds of metadata are we creating, right? That is knowledge about the knowledge. Do we care about race? Do we care about gender? Do we care about age? And so what are these kinds of, lines of inquiry, let's say, that we are concerned about? And furthermore, I think to this point, what's really interesting to me about these questions of standards for data collection is not only the kind of privileging of certain kinds of knowledge, but what was I going to say? What I was going to say was that in terms of production, what I was going to say, excuse me, it's been an early morning. As an archaeologist, what's really interesting is that we often fill out grants for sort of the National Science Foundation, right? And as people that are in this weird intersection between the humanities and sciences, we get a lot less attention and funding. But what's really interesting is that I think there have been studies that show that proposals that have the word climate science or climate change, right, even in the deep past, often don't get funded by Congress, right? Especially Republican-led Congress. So it's really interesting to see, again, what kind of work is getting funded. And so if you're not, at a fancy lab at a fancy private university. You rely often on national funds and public funds to do this kind of important work. And then one last thing that I want to say about open data is that we have a lot of climate data, right? And we have a lot of great scientists that show, maybe it's like 9.8 out of 10 scientists say that yes, the climate is changing and man has had a hand in that, right? And I'm not really sure, and of course, environmental research is so important, we should continue doing it, but at a certain point, what is more scientific research going to do if our agencies and, different kinds of publics don't accept this information? So again, bringing it back to this question of open data, presentation and access are important, but also communication and translation. So storytelling, I think, are really critical. And that's, I think, something that Data Refuge is now working on developing.
And Patricia, if I can ask you, just for those who aren't familiar with Data Refuge, can you just take a minute to explain it a little bit more for those who just aren't familiar with it yet?
Of course. And Paul, please jump in if you feel, yes, please jump in whenever you want. But Data Refuge was actually founded by a bunch of graduate students at the University of Pennsylvania in November 2016. After the election results, we saw we took the campaign promises seriously, and we took the kind of values and politics seriously of the person that was, or the administration that was elected into power. And there is precedence for limiting access to certain kinds of public information, right? So during the Bush administration, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of information regarding education was made in excess, or it was very difficult to access this sort of information. So you have to send in a FOIA request, and who knows how long that takes. And so with partners from end of term archive and at Penn libraries, and people like Denise Ross, we decided to raise awareness and raise advocacy about or around the precarity of certain kinds of open data and open knowledge. And our mission was really to drill out the point that our democracy really depends on open data, right? And continued access to data. As I mentioned, data is not useful unless people use it. And so advocacy was something that was really important to us. And then we hosted over 50 what we call data rescue events across the nation. I really think we had a global interest, right? Because people around the globe also use American public data. But we had these data rescue events that were not only, again, to promote advocacy and to tell stories about what Denise Ross calls use cases, right? Why data is important to certain communities, but we also enlisted the help of archivists and librarians, as well as hackers and people that can write scripts and codes to look through what we call broadly federal agencies that hold climate and environmental data, broadly construed, to see how we could create multiple copies, right, of this information in a repository that you can still, I think, have access to. And so that's very briefly, or that was a really long explanation of what Data Refuge did. And now I think we're in Data Refuge 2.0. So we have this Data Refuge Stories project that I think I'll let Paul explain.
Out of that initial moment, the kind of fear of a doomsday scenario for data, the kind of call to action was among collectives of people who are constituents of data production, data use, data intermediaries, and a number of data publics. And, I do think that initial call to action, to collectivity, did slow down the kind of broad either erasure, removal, or steering away of open data initiatives. And in part, for those who had started nascent programs of open data, it was a kind of call to reinforce infrastructure. For people who were, intermediaries, especially those at libraries, at universities, the kind of sense of responsibility to not assume that the data would be stewarded, that the data would be safe, but to really think about both the kind of conceptual and ethical issues as well as the pragmatic ones. If you are to set out to rescue data, images, let's say from a satellite, where are you going to store it? How many trucks will you need to move it to so-called safety or refuge? And for those who are data publics, people who are eager to be a part of the conversation, but still, let's say, newer users in civic and open data, it was a reminder to learn and to kind of build those bridges. And on one hand, it did help, open and keep open these initiatives. But I think part of where Data Refuge has gone, and a number of our conversations has been, is the kind of mixed bag when it comes to our kind of federal stances on data. That in one sense, open data initiatives still remain, but a number of the administration's kind of tactics around data writ large have to do with data that's proprietary, has to do with data that is selective, that's tied to directives from the administration. And the kind of problems on the back end, especially we see with select information, the EPA, is diverting certain portals, and therefore you have broken links, inaccessible data sets, things that are tied to contentious issues. So for us in the Data Refuge project and with our partners, we're interested in thinking about being data advocates, but really treating data as part of a relationship that we are in, right? So thinking about researchers who for a long time felt like their data was secure, that their ability to open research and inquiry was something guaranteed to them. But how do you shift to understand, on one hand, the dangers of that, but also to reinforce those bonds? So asking researchers to describe their relationship with their data, to come up with storytelling initiatives, a story bank, other points where we are, on one hand, further calling for responsible stewardship, but also making sure to focus on those necessary relationships between researchers, between communities, between users, about the need to hold refuge, to make sure that we are our own stewards of our information.
And just really quickly, I don't mean to hog the mic, but I just want to say one important thing that the Data Refuge Stories project is trying to do is to create a repository of different stories or use cases for how federal and state data are important to communities and citizens. And our hope is that it's not only useful for artists and scholars, but also for activists and policymakers as well, because these are their constituents. And so we're focusing on specific states as well, where this information matters. And so that's sort of another way in which Data Refuge Stories is continuing our initiatives.
Thank you. Gavin, I want to draw you into this conversation. I mean, I think you kind of saw the DC conversation that was playing out, the conversation here in Washington about fears about data. What tangible threats, did you see at the time? What do you think kind of came to you? What were you most concerned? What have you been most concerned about over the past year?
Yeah, so I think I am going to do the annoying thing of not answering the question that you asked, but answering the question that I would prefer to answer, which is to kind of pivot from this conversation about the risks to start thinking about, given that there are risks, what do you do?
Well, let's come back to that, because I want to stick with the risk, because I think it's important that we fully flesh that out. So I understand if you want to decline to answer that particular one. Let me bring in John on this, because obviously Census Bureau has been, just in the past, for the past year, but in particular even in the past weeks, has been in the news and under scrutiny because of concerns about how it might change and how those changes might affect data quality. Can you, first of all, not everyone in this room is probably familiar with the controversies there. Can you first kind of explain the issue there, how you looked at it when you were at Census, and how members of the public should be thinking about these types of issues?
Sure. So the plan for the 2020 census started in 2012, and I got to the Bureau in 2013. The idea was we needed to automate the 2020 census because we couldn't do things that enormous using paper and pencil methodologies anymore. So we developed a strategy to use modern-day automation, including mobile technology and geospatial technology, to really automate the 2020 census. Now, part of the issue there was the Census Bureau was not funded at the level that it requested from 2012 through 2017 or even today. If you look at the Census Bureau's website, you'll see they're $200 million below what they asked for. So that forced a prioritization of activities, and the Census Bureau, and I think rightly so, chose to focus on developing the automation because they really didn't think it was feasible to do another paper and pencil effort. But that meant that some of the operations smaller operations got pushed back and are going to be paper and pencil. It also meant that some of the activities to get the accuracy in a census, which involves communication and working locally with partners, got pushed back as well. So the automation, we'll find out about that soon. They're on track to do an end-to-end test with the Census Day this April 1st of 2018. So, and I know the GAO is here and they'll be looking at it very carefully, so we'll know how that goes. Some of us are very optimistic that it'll work well. However, the big issue is really about two things right now in my mind. It's about funding. The Census Bureau definitely needs all the money that has been assigned to them. They need to have the authority to spend that. If you go to some of my colleagues at the Census Project, you'll see an analysis that would say that they need more money than they've been given. But regardless of that, they need the ability to spend money now, and they're going to need to be able to spend it in 2019. So if there's something called a continuing resolution, the Census Bureau is going to need an anomaly to spend not only at a faster rate, but to spend more money than they spent in 2018, because they just can't delay right now. There's so many things that have to happen to get an accurate census. The other particular issue for an accurate census is, I think you all may have read a number of articles about a request by the Department of Justice to put citizenship on the 2020 census questionnaire. That has never been tested in a census environment. There are great risks that, including that question, particularly in the atmosphere that we're in today, will result in an undercount not just of non-citizen populations, but of other populations that are concerned about what would happen with their data. So that is a tremendous risk for a census that won't be representative like it should be. So we'll see how that plays out. The Census Bureau has to announce the questions they're going to ask on the 2020 census by the end of March, so we'll find out. But that is a huge risk, in my opinion, to getting an accurate census. So it's funding and the citizenship question.
And John, can you kind of explain for, some people would look at that request and they say, well, they're just asking for more data. Isn't more data just good? What would be the response to that?
So the response is that the American Community Survey, which used to be the census long form, has been the source of citizenship data for quite a while, and it apparently, until recently, has been adequate. The big issue, and you can see there's some different documents about this, but the concern is that it will cause a great fear among certain populations that this data would be used for inappropriate purposes. The census has a really hard job to convince everyone about two things. One, why it's important to be counted, which varies considerably depending on what communities need. But the other message that is really critical to get out is that the census is confidential. The census doesn't give their data to anyone, the FBI, what have you. But putting that question on the decennial census has the risk of raising fears among certain populations that it will be very, very hard for the Census Bureau to countermand and get people to convince people to be included in the census. That's the real risk. And a lot of the civil rights groups have written some letters. There's a really good letter on this topic that went to Secretary Ross that came out from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and it's on their website. It's easy to find, and it's a very good letter that really lays out the fact that the question hasn't been tested, what the concerns are, and goes into very good detail about that.
Great. I also wanted to ask you, just again, kind of expanding past the Census Bureau about other federal statistical agencies and any risks that you see in that space. From, my vantage point, one of the challenges that I saw in the first year was simply a staffing issue, where there were a number of agencies that already had staffing issues, that there were surveys that we were trying to get access to for some of our work, and we were told the person in charge of this hasn't been hired, and the data was collected in 2013, or and this so old data.
So you're hitting on a real problem, and it comes in the face of another problem that's been growing, and that is it's getting harder and harder to collect data using surveys. And that, if you look at any survey, response rates are going down. That's both an economic survey, a household survey, and costs are going up. And it's getting to a point where the agencies have to look at alternative ways to supplement surveys and be very innovative about how they produce this data, which could involve using administrative records, using third-party data, using alternative collection schemes. The problem is, as you just alluded to, they're having trouble right now because of funding just putting out the products that they have to put out. And some products are not being put out as frequently as they should, again, because of staffing and funding. And they certainly aren't doing the kind of innovations they need to do to bring the data collection mechanisms into the 21st century. Now, that being said, there is some progress that's being made, that's being directed by the Federal Committee on Statistical Methodology. And if you wanted to find out about that, you could come by the COPAS quarterly meeting this Friday. It's a free meeting. We don't charge. You just let us know, and so we can get you on the list to get in the BLS, and we'll have somebody there talking about that. But the big deal is the agencies are all getting squeezed tremendously in terms of their ability to bring on the kind of staff they need and do the kind of innovation they need to do to keep producing the high quality data that they produce.
Yeah, thanks. Sure.
And could I add just an example around the 2020 census as kind of one of the flagship collections of government data to show how this crunch is playing out. So as part of this shift to a more automated methodology, for the first time in the 2020 census, there will be an online response option for you to complete your census, not on paper or by talking to an enumerator who came to your door, but to fill it out online. And as somebody who went door to door collecting this information, that sounds like great news to me. Anything that we can do to automate that, reduce the cost, and make it easier to collect that data is good, but it's a big transition, and the Bureau has not had, in this 10-year period, the funding, the staffing, the leadership that it has asked for to be able to make sure that that transition is managed well. And in particular interest for us, whenever a government form, a government service that used to be on paper or in person moves online, what happens is that people walk into libraries to use their computers, their internet connections, and to get help in doing it. So, number one, that's a cost shifting from the Census Bureau to libraries. Hopefully, funders will step forward to support libraries in taking on that work, but potentially even more importantly than that is the information that libraries need to know that this is coming so that they can be prepared and ready to help people and have the resources to say, okay, you're coming in because you got this thing in the mail that says you need to fill out this form. Here's what the deal is. Yes, it's a legitimate thing. Here's where you can get some information. Here's where you can use our computer to fill it out, and so on. And it's the Census Bureau's partnership staff that manages those relationships with community groups to be able to work with people like libraries and many of other types of groups to say, this is what's coming, here's what you need to know, here's how we can help you prepare. And those folks are really overstretched right now. They are trying to do everything that they possibly can, but there really needs to be about 5 times more of them as there are. And so especially at this time where there's a big technological change that is happening, there are some political undercurrents with this administration that people have noted. This is a crucial time to have a fully staffed and well-run partnership program in the Census Bureau to get the word out and help people understand what is happening. And because of the budgetary dysfunction, because of the staffing issues, we are really behind where we need to be.
Thanks, Kevin. I just wanted to know, I think you said it was the first time, it would be the first time at scale, but there was an option in 2000 that was never really advertised or promoted because people were concerned about having that online. But it actually, almost 20 years ago, they did do it once online.
I actually did that.
Okay.
And we right at the last minute before the 2000, I was the career person in charge of the 2000 census.
Mm-hmm.
And right at the last minute before the 2000 census, we found that we could develop the ability to take responses over the internet. We did not want to advertise it, though, because we hadn't had time to test it. And it actually worked out. It's a good thing we didn't advertise it, because about a third of the browsers wouldn't work with it.
Mm-hmm.
But for those that would, I think 60,000 responses came in because people, would look over the internet.
Mm-hmm.
But it was only about 60,000.
Yeah. It was a great example, something that was done in 2000 that we're finally getting right, trying to do now 20 years later.
And of course, it's not totally unprecedented. The American Community Survey has been doing online response for a couple of years now. But the scale of this, where every single household in America is going to fill out this form, the scale is really unprecedented.
Yeah. Denise, I want to circle back to you and talk about state and local governments. Just as, the kind of role or responsibilities of the federal government has shifted, or maybe even just the expectations related to open data. One of the most interesting things that I've seen is that you had 12 cities step up and say they're going to host information on EPA data, right? And it was across the country. It was Atlanta, Houston, St. Louis, San Francisco, all stepped up and said, we're going to be repositories for data because we think it's so important to our citizens and our cities. How do you think state and local governments are changing as we kind of enter this new environment of federal data?
So this is the happy part of the story. The state and local, especially local, is really stepping up. I want to give one example that's concrete. So when I was at the White House, I co-founded a project called the Police Data Initiative in response to Ferguson. And the idea was to encourage local law enforcement agencies to proactively, voluntarily open data on use of force, officer-involved shootings, citizen complaints. Back in 2014, that seemed crazy, but now that it's 3 or 4 years later, there's 135 police departments around the country who are committed to opening data on their activities. They've released collectively more than 300 data sets where there were 0 just a few years ago. And that the Police Foundation is a local nonprofit that runs the Police Data Initiative now, and they recently started a hate crime challenge for their agencies. Now, the DOJ already has a voluntary program for local law enforcement agencies to report hate crimes. There are 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the country. Only 15,000 of them have voluntarily joined the DOJ's program. And of those 15,000, 88% report 0 hate crimes. So you can see that there's an opportunity here to improve the data quality and completeness. And through the Police Data Initiative, 35 cities now have stepped on board, cities like Lincoln, Nebraska, Norman, Oklahoma, Bloomington, Indiana, and they are proactively releasing hate crime data But here's the key part. They're releasing it to their constituencies. So it's not a box-checking exercise to report it up to the federal government. They're releasing it to their own communities to improve the dialogue with their communities about hate crimes and ideally improve the reporting cycle so that people who have been impacted by a hate crime want to make sure that their incident ends up in that data set. So for me, that type of local activity is really encouraging, and it's not just individual agencies and local governments who are doing this work, but there are networks of enabling structures. So for example, the Sunlight Foundation has been huge at building the capacity of local government to create their own open data directives. You've got Bloomberg Philanthropies, which has been investing heavily in local government's data capacity. And you've even seen vendors like Esri and Socrata and Microsoft start to change the normative values of just what good government is. Of course you publish your data because that's what good governments do.
Great. I want to stick on the question of basically how they address some of these problems. I mean, we saw, for example, with sexual assault data that one of the challenges was simply in definitions. And so it was very difficult to compare data, especially when you're talking about coming from different jurisdictions when you weren't measuring the same thing. And so, when you get to things like hate crime, when you get to a lot of things that state and local governments collect data on, those same issues continue to arise. How should they be addressing those issues? I mean, do you think initiatives like the Police Data Initiative are able to work down to those issues, or do you need top-level leadership on some of that to kind of get through, just all the bureaucratic complexity?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and the answer is you need both. At the time that we launched the Police Data Initiative, we felt that top-down standards would have squashed innovation, and it turned out there was a lot of room for local innovations. For example, the threshold for use of force in a small town is going to be a lot lower than in a large city, and so you wouldn't want to compare use of force across a small town and a large city because it would look like the small town had a disproportionately higher rate of use of force. And so I think the newer a data set is, the more you want to foster that local innovation. And then as the field starts to mature, you want to see standardization start to emerge. And that can be a bottom up, and it can also be a top down, and ideally they meet in the middle. In the case of hate crimes, NIBRS is already a great standard that's in place. And so police departments who have already adopted the federal NIBRS standard, they're able to very easily publish their hate crime data.
Thanks. And just because I'm curious, why is the use of force, why is that different in small cities?
Because, in essence, policing is a social contract between the police and their community. So there are going to be different standards in different communities.
But I guess why don't understand is why would you have more use of force in a small city? I would actually think it would be the opposite.
They would be more likely to document a lower level use of force.
Okay, got it. So I wanted to spend the rest of the time that we have. So I want to spend about 15 minutes, and then I'm going to open it up for questions on how do we address this problem, both in its form where it's been already realized, as well as the risk of endangered data. Gavin, I was going to ask you to start by talking about the Open Government Data Act, which is obviously kind of a key priority, I think, for most of the open data community.
Okay, so now we have gotten to my pet question. First of all, I would just like to encourage a thought frame for everybody here, which is not how do we protect data from government, but how do we protect data with government? Because there are so many people inside government who are incredibly invested in the production, management, analysis, dissemination, preservation of this data. How do we lift those people up, empower them, give them the tools that they need, form partnerships with them to help them do what they want to do in the face of where there may be some countervailing currents as well. So, and this is important, I think, because there is a remarkably broad and bipartisan consensus around open government data. it's the kind of level of agreement that's usually reserved for stuff like mom and apple pie. So there are a lot of people who are understanding the value of open government data, and it is a matter of converting that level of understanding and support into building the structures and the norms and incentives in order to strengthen the system that we have. So one important way that we have seen that is the Open Government Data Act, which was first introduced at the tail end of the Obama administration and then has been reintroduced last year, which would take a lot of the elements of the Obama administration's executive order around open data, codify and strengthen them so that this would become law that would outlast any one administration, and that it would fully integrate with the statutory system that we have, so that the folks in the agencies who are trying to implement these directives are working with a system that is more coherent and fully embedded. And this is a really notable piece of legislation, not only because it was bipartisan, but actually because the House and the Senate have already both passed this bill, albeit in different forms. And it was the only bill that House Speaker Paul Ryan introduced last year. The only bill that the leader of the House introduced was about open government data and the federal statistical system. I think that shows that there is a high level of understanding on both sides of the aisle that this is a really important issue. And while the House and the Senate have not reconciled their versions of the legislation yet, the fact that they have both passed it indicates that there is a real appreciation for this, and we're hoping soon that they will merge their differences and send a strong bill to the president's desk.
Great. I just want to ask if anyone else wants to comment on that legislation specifically. Okay, great. So Denise, I think it's easy to think that particular data is endangered because it could be seen at odds with the administration's priorities, such as the climate data that we talked about. One of the issues we haven't talked about was some of the surveys and questions about LGBT issues and whether that was on there. But losing access to data can have a considerable consequences for the economy and society. Is it possible to, I think, reframe some of these arguments so the administration might be more receptive to data collection in general? So we kind of move away from policy fights about particular issues to making this really about data, which is, again, as I kind of started with, generally, when we've been talking to people about the open data bill, there's broad bipartisan support for the issue. It was never a Democrat or Republican issue. How do we bring the conversation back so these kind of one-off issues don't make this a partisan issue?
I like to frame this as data are critical infrastructure that communities need to make decisions, and the storytelling. The more specific we can get about stories, real people in real places. Like I mentioned a story, a use case of ranchers requiring the NOAA data in order to be able to apply for federal relief when they have a drought. Find a rancher who used that data to apply for relief and what it meant to that rancher. So bringing it down to real people in diverse situations to demonstrate the value of these data as critical infrastructure. The other thing that I love, especially about, the census is the most important, it's the backbone of all of the data work that we do. And it's required by law. Like, you can't not do it. Don't get too detailed. You don't have to overthink it. It's required, so let's do it right.
Thanks. John, I want to ask you kind of two questions. First, starting with kind of the politics around data. You've obviously seen a lot of those political battles. What's the biggest political challenge associated with getting support for government data, and how do we meaningfully try and address that?
I think the biggest, one of the biggest challenges right now is properly funding this, as you said, critical data infrastructure. And I think that's the number one goal to keeping our data infrastructure current and expanding it and providing the kind of services that we need. But I think funding is the biggest challenge right now.
Yeah. And what's when you're talking to lawmakers on this, I mean, especially in the past, what's been most compelling for them, in terms of loosening the purse strings a bit on funding this?
So I think it's just like what Denise said. It's really explaining to them in terms of examples that they can understand about why the data is important. So it might be taking the American Community Survey and using it to make an investment, to put in an establishment, but it's something that makes the data come alive and shows the importance of it. So the more stories there are and the more use cases that are documented, the easier it gets to make the case about why this data is so important.
So the second, kind of moving away from the politics of it, I mean, when we talk about the changes that are happening, whether it's related to surveys or new methods of obtaining data, and we talk about statistical, modernizing the statistical agencies, can you walk us through a little bit more what that looks like? Maybe give us a preview of your meeting on Friday.
Sure. So, really quickly, the way we collect data for most of the federal statistical system, and the way we protect it was invented at the mid-50s through the 70s, and it's been honed and refined ever since. The problem is that the United States and the rest of the world is a totally different place than it was then, and there's different ways to communicate now. There's different ways that people live. There's different ways that communication is a big thing, and so it's getting harder and harder to use those methods where you contact someone directly or some business directly and get information from them either by self-response or by asking them questions. It's just getting harder and harder and harder, and that's both in the private sector and in the government. And so there are a lot of opportunities to blend data together now, be it administrative records, for example, like potentially using tax data to reduce the burden of the American Community Survey on asking income, as an example, or using some third-party transaction data to reduce the burden on companies that produce retail trade statistics. But it's going to take a lot of work to do that right, because unlike surveys, a lot of these data sets are not fully representative, and you have to understand their properties to put them together, and then you have to be able to describe how good they are. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of work that has to be done. Work has started on that. But I think that's the real challenge that faces the production of good federal data for the 21st century.
Would the end result of that be just simply a kind of a retooling of the agencies, or is it, are you able to obtain efficiency there? Is it a way to actually make the agencies more cost effective?
So I think on top of that, it's certainly an aim to make them more efficient, mm-hmm. in terms of reducing the amount of direct contact you have with individuals or businesses, and putting it more on alternative data sources, so that you still would have some survey data, but it would be less expensive to collect and be more using computer technology to provide data.
And is this something that the agencies can achieve on their own, or is there a need for Congress to help with legislation or short-term funding to allow modernization?
I think the big thing is the funding. The agencies can work with the academic community, they can work with the tech industry, but what they really need is the ability to get people that can do that work. Mm-hmm. People that can work with contractors, people that they can bring in to do that kind of work. But the big challenge they face right now is a funding challenge.
Great. Paul and Patricia, I want to bring you in maybe for last two questions, and I want to open it up. I want you to talk a little bit more about the Data Refuge project and what lessons you've learned through that initiative, or you're learning right now through the initiative. Talk a little bit more about how you see this developing in the future, and particularly around funding. Is it sustainable in its current form? Obviously, the federal government puts a ton of money into making information available. I mean, just yesterday I was trying to download something from the Department of Commerce that turns out the links were all still there, but it was on someone's cloud account, Amazon cloud account, that they're no longer paying for. So it was a bunch of dead links. So, I'm sure, through a FOIA request, I could get it in 3 months, but that's not when I needed it. So just kind of, as you're looking at, how you make this work, what are you seeing?
Yeah. To talk about Data Refuge in a moment, but kind of to get there, circle back to a few conversations, and there seems like a paradox that is worth embracing and thinking through. And on one hand, kind of open data initiatives rely on standardization, or at least aspire to it, right? And we've seen from a number of our collaborators who are data intermediaries, the idea of a kind of buy-in, especially at a local or state level, with specific agencies is kind of automating that process. How can you collect data ongoingly and kind of make that something that's almost depositing in, right, and posting? And on the other hand, there's these questions of how data sets talk to one another, and this question of nuance, as we discussed earlier around whether hate crimes or sexual violence, or we know about environmental categories, that not all data sets fit evenly, like a predestined puzzle. So part of what Data Refuge is trying to do, and I think we look to other colleagues who are doing similar work in terms of data literacy, is really thinking about the ways that we don't necessarily need to separate between data users and data producers, but understand the relationships and bridges that are necessary to uphold that kind of bond, both for the sake of when does data fit together well, where are the breakthroughs, right? These kind of, whether it's the example of finding the best pizza opportunities across town, or other issues around our kind of survival and livelihood. We also want to know where it breaks, where there's challenge, and trying to think about ways that we can rely on one another across fields to think through what we need to do to protect data now, but also advocate for data that doesn't exist yet. So part of what Data Refuge is doing now is, we have our partners, especially at the Penn libraries and other library networks, to think about the data that was either rescued or mirrored, or the processes that had light shed upon them, to make sure that is held secure and ongoingly, but also to build a story bank. And by a story bank, it is building up use cases, other kinds of face-to-face public engagement, and recognizing that some of the most important kind of information, the data about data, may be found online, but it has to happen face-to-face. So for example, we kind of kicked off this phase of the story bank at the American Geophysical Union with over 20,000 scientists, and we went and facilitated in a kind of public practice, public art approach, a face-to-face gathering. And what we really wanted to know was the relationship that researchers have with their data. And we partnered with the Union of Concerned Scientists. And in order to do that, and thinking about the kind of challenges of surveys, we created a game. If you're familiar with Mad Libs, it's a kind of playful fill-in-the-blank game. And so rather than a quiz or rather than a survey, it was an invitation to share. We have the form here if you're so inclined to participate, but it kind of opens with questions like, how old is your data? So at the American Geophysical Union, there were people who have data that's millions of years old. There were graduate students that said, not yet born. We asked where your data lives. Some people said, well, it lives in my computer, but it also, lives in Arctic Sweden or the middle of the ocean or in Sedona. And we asked people their relationship status with their data, right? And, we didn't have to explain it. We just saw this range of, it's kind of like a window into the psyche of research and data producers. It's complicated, best friends, isolated. We're quite close. We talk every day. We look out for one another, and you kind of animate the relationships. So we are building that story bank in preparation for a larger project in partnership with a number of institutions, including Denises New America, and through the National Geographic Foundation, to kind of the story bank as a national project and really try to think through the ecologies of data collection, data use, to think about the ways that we can advocate with researchers and also have the conversation with users as well and understand the kind of life of data.
Patricia, let me just ask you to make maybe a final thought on this, and let me kind of reframe the question a little bit. What I think is, I guess what I want to ask is, are there risks that we're not considering? In particular, we've seen over the past year, a sustained attack on the media with the hashtag fake news. We haven't seen something at the same level of hashtag fake data, right? And we've certainly seen that type of dynamic playing out in certain institutions where the legitimacy of the data has been called into question. But we haven't had, I think, anything on par with what we've seen on the media. If we were to see that in the future, maybe not, I'm not necessarily saying that with this administration, but if something like that were to happen in the future on a particularly hot button issue, are we preparing ourselves ahead of time to really, defend data against that type of sustained attack?
I don't know how to answer that question because it's hard for me to imagine that hashtag. But then again, there are a lot of things that I could, you think it's the end, but then it's something else comes and the limit just gets pushed. All I have to say is that the scientific method and peer review and expertise, so research institutions, for all of their many flaws, I guess, I don't know how, I know you're not asking me to defend data production, but it's really hard for me to imagine that because there are so many different experts working together. There is a peer-reviewed process. I guess
what I mean is I could certainly see. It's very, one of the things we talked about is data quality. It's very easy for someone to start picking out things and saying, look, there's fake data here, there's fake data here, and starting to justify a certain narrative.
So cherry picking and translating certain bits of data to fit a particular agenda. Well, I guess I would answer this question in the way that most of us have answered the other question, which is, I think, that's why storytelling is really, really important. And the more use cases and the more examples for how this information that's not a given, but that's collected by tried and true methodologies are useful to communities who are politicians' constituents, I think that makes for the case for why this data is important. And again, to think about the word endangered, which is a passive kind of qualifier, right? We are putting data in danger mostly because of funding. I think funding is actually the right category, but also if we continue to use the data and use the information and make the case through action, right, for why this information is important at a broader scale beyond levels of high expertise, I think that might help sort of, act as a way to sort of prevent that from happening. And I think that's what Data Refuge is really trying to do. Is how to create these effective stories, right? And I forget when, I think it was last year, the New York Times published this really interesting piece about how farmers within red states, they don't use the word climate change, but they're obviously relying on climate data, and they are feeling the effects of climate change, right? And so I think stories like that are really important examples to explain how that kind of
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. I want to open it up to questions. Yes, right here, sir. And sorry, I think we have a mic that will come to you.
Thank you. Brian Wee from Massive Connections. I would like to key in on Denises' mention earlier of attribution. And actually tie this into stories and also maybe Speaker Ryan's introduction of the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act last year. But so, again, going to stories, wouldn't a different way of telling a story, say if somebody were to come up to an OMB examiner trying to justify investments in open data, right? Wouldn't an alternative story, again, along the lines of the spirit of the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, wouldn't the story be that, the agency is able to create a story of how data is used by private industry, by other sectors, because users of data attributed the use of data back to government, and wouldn't that be another way of telling a story to an OMB examiner who is asking the agencies justify your line item here, and I'd like to get your comments on and maybe if you could talk a little bit further about attribution.
Yeah, absolutely. And having worked both in local government and in federal government, as a data producer, it is really hard to know who's using your data, because the web statistics don't give you much detail. And so being able to, keep a Google alert for any mentions of your data set is sometimes the best that we have. And there's sometimes an artificial wall, and I think you were talking about this, between the data producers and the data users, that, the comms team gets in between you, which is really tough when you're inside of government and you want to be able to explain your data set and the strengths and limitations of it. You've documented as much as you can, but often we aren't able to have that type of authentic conversation between data users and data producers. So if there are ways to break down those walls, I think it would result in much richer stories that people inside of government could use to justify their data programs.
Thanks. We got a couple questions coming in online, so let me do one of those and I'll come back to the room. One of the ones from online was, because data was collected in the past, should it still be collected now? I think a kind of a fundamental question. Yeah, the question is, because some data was collected in the past, does that mean it should still be collected now?
So I can answer that. Having been in the position where I have to decide whether to kill a data set or not, I think we can agree that if data has been published, it should not be unpublished. With a few exceptions, if, for example, some PII accidentally got into the data set. But again, breaking down that barrier between government and the public so that before you kill a data set, have a conversation with stakeholders in the community. There's librarians, data journalists, and data intermediaries, like the National Neighborhood Indicator Partnership. They're really easy go-to users that government can engage when they need to make those decisions.
Great.
Yeah. And to add to that, I think it's that conversation about what to do with data that you've inherited is worth having, of course, for particular issues, particular data sets. I would say, that historical perspective is incredibly important. And even if you collect new categories, there are certain things that may feel either obsolete or anachronistic. The ability to read change over time is fundamentally one of the most important parts of data. And so, I think also to that question about attribution, it is really important to know who's using the data now, but we're really talking about legacies and legacies of reading how our society functions, and some of that is made quite clear in data sets regarding climate. It's also made quite clear in legacies of, equity and justice. And you think about the ways, even if there are questions about data sets of how redlining maps were used in the 1930s and how they tell us about other lines of division today, or how you make cases for understanding a place over a long kind of time scale, that this is kind of a way that you shape legacy is by understanding change over time.
Yep. Yes.
Yeah, hi. I'm Casey Egan with CQ. So some of these threats to open data that you've discussed today, take the example of the FBI shaving off attributes from crime reports for one. What are some specific areas where this sort of erosion of open data has led to a decline in evidence-based policymaking?
Well, so certainly on gun control, as I kind of started off the conversation, we've written also about some of the surveys for elder adults and assisted living. There was a question around sexual orientation there, with the goal. This was something that was started to be put through the process. The goal was to say, is the older LGBT community, do they have certain needs that aren't being met in these facilities? Taking those types of questions out means you can't implement any policies, you can't do any research on those types of questions. So that's the type of change that we're seeing. I mean, certainly on Census, the question of citizenship has far-ranging implications for the type of data quality, and then the data that's available to make a range of evidence-based policy decisions. Yes.
Hi, Tricia Durr. What actions are being taken? I think we're on the threshold of some real data security issues, perhaps from not just within our frenemy population, but also true enemy, wanting to mess with, especially data that is the basis of our democracy and other processes.
Which panelist wants to take this one?
Unfortunately, I'm not the best person to talk about this. I mean, I used to have a lot of people that worked for me that were experts in security and data security, but as Patricia says, it's a real issue. Not just protecting data from intrusions, but it's getting harder and harder to release data and assure the privacy of individuals, just given all the multitude of data sets and the advanced computing power. That's another challenge that we need to be aware of.
I think a more acute risk, especially at the local level, is that the laws haven't caught up with the technology. So we've seen cases where law enforcement are releasing 911 calls for service, but inadvertently in the process identifying victims of sexual assault and other crimes that should be protected. But the law hasn't caught up yet.
And I'll add one comment on that. I mean, one of the benefits, I think, of the federal evidence-based policymaking legislation is that it tries to address the problem of that there is value in sharing data among government agencies for research and analytical purposes that isn't going to be released publicly. So trying to break through some of those barriers, because right now one of the benefits of open data is simply that you can get data from one agency to another, that it might be hard to do that any other way. The problem is that doesn't work for data that has sensitive information that can't be released. So this law, I think, will help allow some of the data to flow across government for certain allowed uses, but not everything. We're at time, so I have to stop it here. I know some of our panelists will be sticking around, so I invite you to come up. But please join me in thanking our panelists for this conversation. Thank all of you for being here today.